I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today I continue with section 4.9 of The Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri. Book 3, Space and Man. Synopsis. If science is correct in determining the Earth to be composed of the same stuff which makes up the cosmos, and if life is the technology through which such stuff becomes animated, then life, which now appears to be the exception to the rule within the physical cosmos, could eventually become the rule. If, in addition to being feasible, this potential animation of the cosmos is also desirable, then the responsibility of life lies in the transfiguration of an immensely powerful physical phenomenon into an immensely loving spiritual one. An eschatological imperative, the estetogenesis of the universe. On what can be defined as the threshold to the infinity of space, the human species is going to make momentous decisions. Some of them will be unconscious and irreversible, some will be conscious and crucial. First, if the space colony venture is to be developed, we must seek consensus. In an undertaking of this magnitude, it has to be a transnational consensus, and it must be knowledgeable. This will be impossible if the pioneers and promoters themselves are less than clear about the scope and impact of the enterprise. What follows is a tossing in the air of a few points of concern about which consensus might be sought, the sooner the better. A. The technological concern. I am not well equipped to tackle the technical underpinnings and therefore assume, for the sake of what follows, that we are capable of doing what the scientists and the technologists say can be done. At the same time, since its end product will be habitat, the technological concern is very close to my interest. Ultimately, the technological concern is subservient to the eschatological concern, and the habit will have to be imprinted on by it and imbued with it. B. The political economic concern. It is per se a tangled knot to which we respond or react in more and more empirical ways, because the inertial stresses pervading it are increasingly beyond our limited wills and wisdom. C. The eschatological concern. There will be renewed religious unrest caused by the space probe, focusing on eschatological issues which will embrace social, environmental, cultural, ethical, and aesthetic concerns. All operate directly upon the human condition in conjunction with the questions of health and genetic preservation. This last concern will be largely unspoken and intentionally brushed under the rug of hard facts and technopolitical imperatives. And yet the stakes are frightfully high. We must face what we are about to plan and implement. Under the pressure of scientific and technological progress stimulated by the space venture, the eschatological concern will give rise to new or pseudo-new theological models. Thus, as I perceive it, the probe of life into space is ultimately not a technological, political, or economic problem, but a theological one. The eschatological implications of space colonization are fundamental and critical. I will consider the following aspects. 1. The eschatological concern. The question of the ultimate aim and purpose of life, the eschatological paradigm as such. 2. The genetic concern. The splitting of the human species into subspecies, which has a prehistoric precedent as a direct consequence of space being invaded by humanity. 3. The urban concern. The space probe is the urban probe on new grounds. Therefore, the urban question looms ever larger in the destiny of the species. Depending on how these questions are approached, hope or despair will emerge. In despair, 1a, we see ourselves as well-worn sorcerers' apprentices, incapable of halting the plunge into technological hubris, which will more and more forcefully bring upon us the wrath of our indignant Father, the Lord, and our merciless expulsion from nature's bosom. 2a. The human species, abandoned by the Lord Providence and instinctual wisdom, will tear itself apart under the stress of new environs and spawn inimical subspecies which are foreign to each other. These will find their own nemesis in specialization, genetic or otherwise. 3a. The human species will make an ever more compromising step into the urban syndrome, seen as the sum of all evil, since space colonization will be directly informed by those conditions which per se define the current urban context. In hope, 1b. We are making a Promethean commitment to the spirit by taking action to release it from the gravitational vice of the earth, and by opening the cosmos to urbanization, that is, to logos. 2b. The human family recognizes its genetic and other limitations, and willfully seeks morphologically new cognitive forms, for the purpose of outfitting itself for the immense journey into the spirit via the flesh, the process being a lengthy series of transcendences of psychosomatic self. 3b. In stepping off the earthly landscape, man is turning, by necessity which will become virtue, toward a frugality of environs and hardware specific to the urban condition, toward ever more crucial transphysical longings. In sum, man will opt for the self-containment of his habitats, their inward orientation, the cooperative and interdependent nature of the social and cultural texture, high-density performance, the imperative of integrity and self-reliance, and finally, the complexity and miniaturization of the milieu. The Space City will therefore be an unequivocal test of our readiness for the vertigo of a momentous step towards spirit. I will proceed through the hopeful triad, since there is where I stand, and since in so doing it will be possible to examine the despair triad as well. 1. The eschatological concern. First, I must critique the lifeboat metaphor and the carrying capacity thesis. I would offer the notion that their weaknesses do not come so much from relativism peculiarly anchored to the consumer ethic, the gross national product mentality, but from the scientific theory on which they stand being quite possibly unscientific, basically a verification of past facts, which shies away from expectations that appear unscientific, since they are only in the realm of the possible. If this is so, if the science of the carrying capacity and lifeboat ethic is unscientifically applied, then its use is needlessly vicious. It is the viciousness of inflicting pain and death by the incongruous application of a paradigm. Let's look at the carrying capacity thesis as it seems to have developed. The first living thing on this planet had, as a necessary support system, the entire existing cosmos, since only the existence of a specific if unknown cosmic balance made possible a specific if unknown solar system balance. This made possible on Earth the appearance of a specific organism. One had to be the first. The cosmos in toto was the territorial imperative of a bacteria-like organism. No cosmos as such, no bacteria as such. Even at the moment, or a bit sooner, things were becoming autonomous, that is to say, not purely deterministically generated. Life forms were not hopeless prisoners of a totalitarian cosmic dictum. The solar system was coming to life, and on Earth, for instance, physical balances were affected by physiological counterbalances. Oxygen was freed into the forming atmosphere through the initiative of living organisms, etc. A first massive implosion of territoriality from cosmos to solar system, specifically Sun, Earth, Moon, was taking place. So it came to be that the territory of each organism was a proportional fraction of Earth bulk, to which was added a similarly defined fraction of the Sun energy falling upon Earth, and in addition relatively small influences such as moon tides, cosmic radiation, etc. If one takes a look at the contemporary scene and simplifies the model, one sees that every human being requires the presence and use of a cone of matter, defined by the radius of the Earth, which a base measured by a circle upon the biosphere atmosphere included, of let's say approximately 100 acres. This gigantic mass, to which must be added its share of sun energy, is but an infinitesimal fraction of the original mass necessary for the advent of the first bacteria-like organism, and we begin to feel crowded. But we also begin to appreciate the providential tendency of life toward frugality. Providential, since if it were otherwise, we would soon be face to face with the fatal dialectic of a self-parting, expanding universe and a level of consciousness that must abide by the fierce rules of shrinking carrying capacity, face to face with lifeboat ethics, triage, etc. That is to say, without the tendency toward frugality, there would not be the rationale of evolutionarily expanding capacity, extension of reach, and contraction of needs, but rather an ontological wall made of indisputable and ultimate stop signs, a dying sun, the size and resources of the earth, and consequently, life seen as a short fireworks display of arrogance and opulence. Where is an even more incredible explosion of frugality in store? It is in the most frugal and crowded mode of all, the brain of man, that powerful cognitions are working out more miracles of contraction and frugality, the urban effect in full swing. And lo and behold, a few 100,000 years after the invention of divinity, that prophecy of utter economy, the mind conceives a fully lived extraterrestrial existence. The implosion in the brain creates, at least potentially, an explosion of ecologies, eventually unlimited in number, capable of sustaining and developing life ad infinitum. If for a moment we assume that we will make the step of colonizing space and do it without diminishing man, then what do we have? An utterly new relationship with the world of matter. We will literally mine the universe, the solar system at first, rearranging and processing matter into hollow cities of all sizes, types, and populations. The order of the Christian God, go and multiply, would see an unimaginable degree of realization, and the carrying capacity of the cosmos would grow exponentially. With this, the lifeboat theory would be blown to bits, since it would serve only that self-righteous society unwilling to get down to tasks and construct new boats, one after the other, on and on, forever. But why such explosion of life? For what purpose? The answer is theological. Before going into it, let's reiterate what would happen to the territorial imperative. With the space venture, the bulk of matter necessary for each person would shrink dramatically from the individual earthly cone, with a corresponding ecological veneer and sun energy, into a bulk on the scale of a home attached to an urban landscape, to which would be added an open space of some acres, or a fraction of an acre, and some energy from the sun and stars on which the city might depend. In other words, it would be as if the Earth, or any other celestial body, were to be peeled off in successive skins, each containing an interiorized landscape of minimal physical bulk, a characterization of the human environs as exponentially frugal. Thousands upon millions of hollow worlds, interoriented because of locally produced gravity, would invade the universe from as many points in it as there were conscious centers. Eventually, each galaxy would have the carrying capacity of 4,000 million consciences, billions of times over, a true explosion of consciousness throughout the physical universe. What is so desirable in such a model? On the personal level, one could ask if one would choose to be born. Even if the personal answer is no, to negate the birth of others, provided there is carrying capacity, would be rude to say the least. On the ontological level, it would seem clear that it is only with the intensification of reality by the presence and action of life that we might eventually bring compassion and grace to the whole cosmos, the integrated universe. The theological answer, insofar as life and consciousness can be generalized, implies that 1. Consciousness is an unbelievably interiorizing stress. 2. Consciousness is an unbelievably complexifying stress. 3. Consciousness is an unbelievably miniaturizing stress. 4. Consciousness is an unbelievably fugalizing stress. 5. Consciousness is an unbelievably animating stress. 6. Consciousness is an unbelievably transcending stress. 7. Consciousness is an unbelievably urbanizing stress. And 8. Consciousness is an unbelievably divinizing stress. It is only half true that there are but potential powers of consciousness. A cursory survey of life's evolution clearly, if coarsely, demonstrates such power. These implications are all versions of the fact that the eschatological imperative is issued from reality as an inescapable demand. Do unto matter, the mass energy universe, what you do unto yourself. Make it into conscious matter, into logos, that is, demand and force out of an ephemerally conscious universe that which will ultimately be a child god of infinite conscience, infinite integrity, infinite love. When the biological has reached dimensional limits, the size of organic molecules, and has not been supplanted by quote-unquote better media, since only that which can plan and operate congruously intellection can also put more understanding, design, and will into ever smaller amounts of mass energy, space-time. It is the space city, the ubis et orbis in one, which is to be sought as the next step toward logos. This is a statement of feasibility and desirability at the same time. To work against the process is ultimately to work against logos itself, and consequently against the spirit. This feasibility demands implementation. The question remains open, when? It would be then for the sake of logos that life must free itself from the earthly prison. And if it is possible for life to free itself from the earth, isn't it then a mortal sin not to do so? And isn't the fact that life could not even conceive of leaving the earth before the appearance of consciousness, and the fact that thousands of years ago the first step toward this leaving expressed itself in metaphorical religious form, proof of sorts that it is the task of life, and specifically of consciousness, to do just so? From a territoriality of the whole cosmos necessary for the appearance of the first living cell on Earth, to the ecological cone necessary today for each creature populating the Earth, to the minute territoriality of a space city, we can measure the powerful trend toward frugality and the concurrent opening of the whole universe to the spirit. Once upon a time, a whole cosmos for one infinitely puny life. Eons later, intellection grasps at the alchemy of matter and makes it deliver its latent energy and potential conscience, giving impetus to the possibility of mining the cosmos, of making a moon into a large number of Earths, etc. The ape, tethered by gravity pulling down toward the center of the Earth, has its own territorial imperative by the ecological capacity of the Earth. With the appearance of the human mind, the tether is potentially cut. The ecological capacity is potentially transferred from the limited Earth to the endless universe. For this potentially quasi-infinite growth of liveliness, two things seem to be indispensable: a quasi-infinite growth of will and a quasi-infinite growth of reverence. Given these, divinity is inherent in the future. There are two final considerations relative to the eschatological concern. A1. How much or how little we make of liveliness and consciousness spirit is somewhat irrelevant, since no matter what opinion we have of them, to have an opinion, any opinion, is per se an identification of ourselves with them. One option we do not have is to give them up without giving up life itself. The fostering of these elements turns out to be a law of nature which tautologically states that the ultimate meaning of the ensuing process will not disclose itself before its exhaustion. Delayed disclosure is not due to secrecy but to incompleteness. To reveal itself to itself before the end, the omega condition, would be an anticipation of creation. Religious structures are this anticipation, and as such they are an important exercise in futurism. But by necessity, those exercises fall short of target, since the target is not there yet. It will be there only at the end of the process. 2. A word about compatibility. Each generation has its own environmental compatibility. That is to say, a person is hard put to reject those conditions with which he has grown up. But each generation is piggybacked on the preceding one. The individual cycle demands a return to the infancy grounds. Re-entry into the mother, we call it the father. And for each infancy, such grounds are the maturity grounds of the parents, the preceding generation. This is providential since it secures both change and continuity. In fact, it would be difficult if not impossible to come up with a better scheme. This dialectic of change versus continuity makes conflict inevitable. It follows that it would not be only unrealistic, but downright unjust and cruel to want to thrust the move to space upon the present generation as if it were a pleasure trip or a palatable prospect. But it could be for our grandchildren. The fact remains that, notwithstanding the incompatibility parameter, the parameters of territory, carrying capacity, and environmental development are in constant flux and expansion. 2. The splitting of the human species into subspecies. One of the most momentous outcomes of successful space colonization will be the appearance of human mutants who will perform more fittingly not just in one's new environment, but in a variety of new environments. We are the children of our environments. A most critical area of decision or non-decision is, therefore, the genetic pool area, and with it new conceptions of human values, justice, equity, hierarchy, fairness, etc. Are we able to withstand the thought that quite possibly, perhaps inevitably, humankind might become fractionalized into, for instance, living fossils, the Earthlings, psycho-techno-man, cyborgs, or Superman, an intellect, relayed multitude constituting a single creature, similar but on a different ledge of evolution to an insect colony? Since the future is not a process like the unrolling of a sacred skull, but is instead a process of creation, nothing that we might conjecture or plan will ever turn out to be the future. Therefore, as it is quite possible that we might never leave the Earth, it is also quite possible that a polarization on this planet might eventually force upon us some strange variances from the humankind we are now accustomed to resign to. That is to say, a genetic schism might be not only a consequence of or peculiar to space colonization, but could be in fact the cause for space colonization. Isn't what is going on now with the mystique of technology a kind of pilot project for a mutation in the making, which in turn urges man into its space probe? Technological man, the infant terrible of the 21st century, could be the mutant that has yet to find a sound justification for his appearance. Now or soon as a form, a container filling itself with purpose, he could cause life to extrude itself into a new set of parameters, a new universe authored by consciousness, and its prowess in understanding, guiding, transforming, metamorphosing. Are we in for a radiant new creature, or are we in for life's abjection? The question is open and will be open for eons. In fact, from our earthly perspective, from our present, That possible radiant creature would be a monster anyhow, since we could not stand the sight of it. Whatever the case, we cannot escape the future, and therefore might as well become conscious of some of its possibilities. A. Since it will not make sense to copy the Earth's environment over there, environments more congruous to the space situation will eventually define new morphological characteristics of fitness and response. Our physiological makeup might end its usefulness, but well before such definitive makeup might end its usefulness, well before such definitive and radical dismissal of the organic, see mass transit, mass delusion, we will probably mutate ourselves into cyborgs of sorts, as we do already in the push-button syndrome. B. In the meantime, will there be a transformation of the mother-lover-son drive in favor of a scientific intrusion into the immensely chancy but immensely rich genetic pool afforded by the heterosexual mechanism? Might not this powerful and as yet unpredictable gene pool be the best, if not the only insurance policy against any cosmic emergency? Should we then dare to take such a step? C. What besides the ability to think will eventually make spacemen like Earthlings? And what if the thinking apparatuses themselves become extravagantly different? D. Will there be a change of heart over slavery, since sooner or later the notion of superior and inferior might be fostered among genetically different subspecies and peer groups? A benign version of such discrimination would make way for the Earth as a living museum, the Earthlings and their beautiful Earth visited now and then by chartered space fraternities. A benign hypothesis in the restricted sense of doing away with violent confrontation, bloodshed, and genocide. We must beware not to make humanity into insularity and eventually into bigotry. If it is true that man is unique, it is also true that he's uniquely isolated and confined, possibly isolated because confined. But what if he were to explode at first into the solar system, then into the Milky Way? Would there not then be good reasons for the species to venture into new, unthinkable explorations of the psychosomatic potentials we carry, in view of encounters with other centers of consciousness and grace? If one has to admit pure terror vis-a-vis the opening of a galactic trapdoor under one's humble but arrogant, venturesome but cowardly, compassionate but bigoted self, one must also be encouraged by the possibly infinite radiance of the future on which such a trapdoor is opened. 3. The space probe is the urban probe. Are we really working at the creation of a sun god, the masterpiece of evolution? Or have we deviated in the process and become the authors of a monster? To get an answer, I think we have to consider the normative mode I call the urban effect. The transformation of the cosmos in the direction of the spirit is the urban effect. The urban effect is the eschatological imperative. As a corollary, divinity is the urban effect, since the urban effect is yet at an embryonic stage of development. The city today is not very close to what it will be, nor is God close to being the monistic and absolute center of love we religions anticipate. But there's an imminent urban effect which incarnates a limited divinity, the immanent God, the God of the present. This choice of terms, urban effect, divinity, God, is neither causal nor sensational. It puts an eschatological thrust into the human condition by going at the mainspring of human performance where it becomes social, cultural, civilizing civic man. Civic man is not an experiment from which life might or will derive some advantages. He is instead the manifestation of the same kind of thrust that throughout evolution has and will keep the living stuff working upon raw matter at the cutting edge of consciousness. The urban effect is the causal stress which forces the production of enclaves of consciousness, starting with the most ephemeral, the original microorganism, which appeared on this earth thousands of millions of years ago. These enclaves of consciousness will eventually incorporate all of the universe in ways and expressions as multiple as the worlds involved in the process and the times in which they perform. Then will occur a further synthesis into the oneness of Omega. The frugal character of the process ensures that the end will not find itself short of means by seeing that the end means equation will grow exponentially to the final point where the numerator is near infinity and the denominator is near zero. The enclaves of consciousness would eventually join together, thanks to the implosive force of the complexity miniaturization paradigm, which will be enabled by cognition to warp the cosmic laws into divine law. It could be said that it is not so much the case of increasing the amount of spirit consciousness that might exist scattered throughout the cosmos as the endowment of each particle, but it might be the case instead of degradation and conjunction of each particle of consciousness with the others by way of the urban effect and the creative process which ensues from it. The original atomized spirit, the atoms of consciousness which can be conjectured to be composing the universe, this alpha 1 minus 10 to the 80th God, is a prisoner in its own iron cage of determinism together with the other 10 to the 80 minus 1. And it is one of the 10 to the 80 to the 6 deities of the pristine polytheistic universe. What is the logical thread that causes the urban effect to be the eschatological thrust? It is the common rule that any discipline, the eschatological thrust in the present case, has to foster that which originated the conditions allowing for its birth. If the urban effect was the causa prima for the advent of consciousness spirit, then the enhancement and impregnation of the cosmos by conscious spirit is dependent on how forcefully the urban effect multiplies and reinforces itself throughout the cosmos. There's a sort of premonitory situation which must be read even though it justly but unjustly sends shivers down one's own spine. It is written in the invertebrate, on land and sea, in societies of insects, in slime, mold, slugs, and in the various and infamous ant or termite colonies, wasp and bees' nests. These are aggregates of acting matter, and why not thinking matter comparable perhaps more to the mammal brain, and its own specialized hierarchy than to anything else? Gravity itself seems forgotten for the time being, so much is the living matter inner-oriented, totally absorbed in itself, pure living matter, flesh thinking flesh. These are proto-conscious cities, anticipatory, if brutishly so, or urbis where the dependence on matter becomes less and less measured by bulk and more measured by arrangement and discrimination, complexity and miniaturization, intensity and transcendence. If there is an eschatological guide to turn to for assistance in our decisions and actions, and if this guide is predicated on the emergence of the divine via creative genesis, then breaking away from the earth's bondage is indispensable. It is not indispensable in the sense of being also sufficient. In fact, this breakaway could end up being an escape from responsibility and grace, but rather in the sense that there is no access to full divinity without the concrete intrusion of consciousness into all corners of the universe. Call it, if you like, redemption of matter whose sin is not to be as such as it ought to be, spirit. Or call it, as I prefer, the creation of a new and divine universe, where each and all things are a radiant and transparent synopsis of each and all times in all places. This assertion is not a burning of one's bridges to ecologically minded salvation. It is a reinstatement of the concept that the bridge between matter and spirit is matter becoming spirit, and the process cannot be halted by any accidental moment, the present. That the notion of breaking away from the earth is contemplated in most religions shows the anticipatory power of theological thinking. Usually this anticipation is not seen as entailing a physical migration of this life from the planet to other places, but if this is the interpretation, then the anticipation is wanting and the prophecy does not fit the eschatological grid. It would not suffice that the cosmos might sit in adoration around earthly magnets of intellection, as many of them as there might be scattered throughout it, thousands of millions. Intellection must move into the cosmos and consume it into consciousness, make it suffer the intellection of itself, and cause it to transself itself and create the not yet divine. Reaching for the divine, the work of the spirit, demands the inexhaustible bridge of matter, all matter consuming itself into its own entelechy. This is essentially the imperative of intensifying the performance of matter mass energy, that is to say, it is to cause the urban effect to become the universal concern, the rule and not the exception, and ultimately cause not so much the city of God, but instead and indeed the God city, the omega ubis et orbis. It might indeed be indispensable that our anthropomorphic God be reinvented into God in the likeness of the city, with the massive reservation that both the urban effect and the ultimate entelechy expression of it in divine terms are inconceivable, unimaginable for our limited conscience and grace. To make a pale metaphor, to think of omega ubis et orbis as a redeemed Detroit is comparable to the mystification one would experience if presented with a tiny blob of tissue and embryo and told that one beheld a beautiful, mature person. Editor's note: current political situation in the United States makes that a very ironic statement. Moving on. The mystification would be even greater if the embryo turned out to be not that of a human but of a fly. Detroit is to the God City as the embryo of a fly is to a full-grown person. Between the two is the demonism of the evolutionary metamorphosis, with its own cul-de-sacs and its own triumphs. Therefore, what we will weave in space is going to be a series of cities that will add new force, new degrees of eventfulness, new situations to the urban effect. One, quick to come to mind, is freedom from the gravity burden, leading to consequent genetic alterations. Another is the physical interiorization of the environments and consequent psychosocial cultural alterations. And another is the crowding syndrome coming to fruition with new force. Crowding in this use of the term is not the bunching together of people, things, and time, but the highly selective, discriminating coming together of disparate and per se less intense elements in similar but not identical ways as within an organism, plant, animal, or associations of organisms. Crowded, living, durational events incredibly full of interdependent processes responding to the needs and hopes of the organism. Since crowding is a divine attribute, co-present, co-creation, understanding, knowledge, reverence, fullness, radiance, then the urban effect, the crowding effect, is inexorably present whenever and wherever there is a thrust towards such a condition of grace. In summary, 1. Space migration is on the human agenda. 2. Is space migration now a responsible act, a diversion, or pure escapism? A careful scheduling of our means, intellectual, ethical, and otherwise, might show that the best defense against the squalor of the lifeboat theory and carrying capacity miscalculations is the ultimate frugality of a life thrust which can and must pervade the cosmos. 3. True frugality is the antithesis of mediocrity. See relative poverty and frugality. Therefore, a vivification of the cosmos which cannot be frugal is bound to move man to a higher ledge of the evolutionary pyramid. 4. To this end, there is no escaping the need for a more reverential, urbane, civilized sense of human experiment, and ultimately the need for the eschatological vision of a universe in the process of self-divinization, the urban effect. It is in the nature of the progression that sees matter becoming spirit, the entelechy of itself. Under the pressure of the urban effect, the conscious intellective life on and in the seas will not be, forever, an exception to the rule. The uniqueness of the environment should be guaranteed of the uniqueness of the modes and structures adopted and defined there. I see two main dangers. 1. The exploitation syndrome. And 2. The hedonism syndrome. The exploitation syndrome, typified by the oil rig, sees the sea as a nuisance, an expensive one, and seeks the shortcuts which will reduce the cost of exploitation by concealing the true price tag. There will be, therefore, for the conservationists, the task of digging out the inner costs, disregarded intentionally or in ignorance by the exploiter. The hedonism syndrome. Less capable of environmental evil within certain limits of development, is de facto one of the main promoters of resource exploitation, since it demands an even greater variety of support systems, equipment, and logistics, and because it appeals to ever wider markets. But there's a specific potential for evil in the hedonism syndrome, which makes it far more insidious. It is a possibility it projects of a culture desperately mediocre, a recessive culture, a genetic retrogression. To make the point in evolutionary terms, I offer the following parable. Once upon a time, two divine beings came out of the sea and dwelled on land. They toiled within an environment which turned out to be harsher than the one they'd left. But through their toil, a new radiance emanated from them. They were conscious of their consciousness. They were becoming creating creatures. Then one day, one of the beings fell victim to loss of anima and returned to the sea. He was the ancestor of whales and dolphins. That creature that stayed on land was the ancestor of man. In the Eden of the watery universe, hedonism has imprisoned the consciousness of conscious and kept it in a twilight of innocence. In the stormy landscape of stone and soil, of marginal life or exuberant life, an immensely radiant destiny is being woven on the warp of time. It would be tragic if the involvement of contemporary man in the sea world were to be delayed return to innocence, since the outcome would be not innocence but sloth charged at best with guilt, at worst with irresponsibility. It is therefore not a return which we must seek, but the forceful intervention of the urban effect within the ocean ecosystems and the development in them of civilizations that would implement originally, that is to say, radically new expressions of the spirit. Thus concludes section 4.9 of the Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri, Space in Man, part of book 3. Tomorrow I continue with section 4.10, the urban effect as the genesis of the divine. I will see you then. Alam.